So, if our individuality is just a story we tell ourselves, and the physical world isn't, well, physical, then who or what are we? Who am I? When I was 17 years old, admittedly quite a long time ago, I developed some severe migraines. These were not your run-of-the-mill headaches. These were knock down, drag out, knock me off my feet, onto the floor, nasty migraines, pounding my head as if I was being stabbed in the head. The doctors did everything they could to figure it out. Eye tests, various drugs, things like that. Nothing was working. I lost a semester of school. I was in college at the time. I lost 3 months of work. And finally, even though this was the 1970s, I turned to meditation. Meditation in those days wasn't the mindfulness therapies we have today. It was more born out of the East. I practiced Zen. I practiced some other types of meditation. And this really seemed to help. But I noticed some things as I meditated. As I closed my eyes and went inside, first the physical world dropped away. It wasn't there anymore. It was just me inside my brain. And as the thoughts dropped away and the mind became more empty, I ended up in a place where I wasn't perceiving anything, but I was definitely there. There was a consciousness that was there. There was an I amness that was there, even when nothing else was. And as I went deeper and deeper into this sometimes spread out as if I were everywhere, as if consciousness was oneness and spread across the entire universe. And I wondered, what is this? And then, of course, when I opened my eyes, here I was back in the world. Day-to-day chaos was back. The job was back. College was back. I had to deal with the actual physical world again. So because I had done this with meditation, I decided to study more Eastern spirituality. Now, I was a very strict Western scientific materialist. I assumed that what science hadn't answered, any questions that were still open, it would eventually answer, including the question of what is consciousness. But because of my meditation, I dove into Eastern spirituality, partly because that's where it came from, and partly because Eastern spirituality didn't speak to you have to have a god or something like that. It dove into what my experience was, and it spoke to me that way. Interestingly enough, we have now done scans of the brains of master meditators who undergo this same thing, where things quiet down, consciousness seems to become universal. And you would think, with that consciousness spreading out everywhere, that the brain would just light up. But when they do what's called functional magnetic imaging, fMRI scans of master meditators, their brain doesn't light up. And I could have told you this from my meditation. It goes quiet. It stops lighting up. So somehow when they meditate and the brain quiets, they become more conscious, not less. Now take that and they do the same fMRI scans on people who are tripping on various psychedelics, psilocybin, DMT, things like that. And with the trips these guys experience, they expect their brains to light up. But they have some of these same reported experiences where they say, you know what? I felt this oneness. I thought I was everywhere. The same kind of experiences that master meditators report. But they expected with a lot of the hallucinations that go on, their brains are going to light up. Nope, the exact same thing as with the meditators. The brain quiets down, and specifically the default mode network, a network of neurons in your brain that is responsible for what we sometimes call the monkey mind, your self-talk. Your self-talk tells you who you are all the time. When that goes quiet, your identity as an individual goes quiet, and the universe opens up. So if consciousness comes from the brain, how come we feel more of it when our brain goes quiet? This didn't make a whole lot of sense to me and to a lot of people. One of those people is Annaka Harris. She is a science reporter. She's the wife of Sam Harris, a famous neuroscientist and philosopher. She had some of these same questions. But unlike me, she had access to all the best minds in the world. Neuroscientists like Christoph Koch and Niels, physicists like Brian Greene and Carlo Rovelli, philosophers like Philip Goff. So she dug into this in two books, the book Conscious and the audio documentary Lights On, to try to figure this out. And she starts from a very physicalist perspective, trying to solve what's called the hard problem of consciousness. How does our brain produce consciousness? She makes that assumption. This hard problem was first coined by David Chalmers, who put it as there's a lot of easy problems. Things like we can do scans and see neuronal pattern firings for different experiences. But what we can't do is figure out why that gives rise to an inner subject. Why do we have the lights on, as Annaka Harris would say, and experience something at all? And as she dug into this hard problem, she had a couple of key realizations. One, it may not require neurons. Trees have these underground networks they communicate through to warn others of impending dangers, display intelligent reactions to their environments. And they have no neurons. So what is that? She also took a look at split brain patients. Their brains had been cut in two for therapeutic reasons, and they seemed to have different perceptions in the different sides of their head. So that also didn't comport. But really the one that didn't was a concept that David Chalmers called philosophical zombies. Could I create a being that looks just like me, acts just like me, behaves just like me, but the lights aren't on? There's no inner subjective experience. Is there a way to do that? And Annaka realized that all the things that evolution has given us in order to survive do not need to have an inner consciousness to make it happen. I often will react to something like a snake in the grass before I'm ever conscious of it. And she looked at reactions like that, where a lot of the things we do and decisions we make are done before we're consciously aware of them. So we don't need consciousness to actually survive in this world. So consciousness shouldn't be an evolutionary survival advantage. Where did it come from? Ultimately, she finally concluded consciousness must be fundamental in the universe. And not only is it fundamental in the universe, it is the fundamental. Space, time, matter, all must derive from consciousness. You can easily derive the physical universe if you start with consciousness, but you can never derive a single conscious thought from a universe of dead matter. Next, I went and turned to the OGs of quantum physics, because I thought quantum mechanics shows a lot of problems with the observer effect, measurement problem, entanglement, things like that. What did the original physicists here actually think of all this? What did they make of this? And it turns out they ended up being kind of mystical themselves. That was the only way they could square it. Erwin Schrödinger, famous for his wave equation, was actually inspired by his study of the Indian Upanishads to create his wave equation. He realized that we must all be one. There's one big wave that collapses as it is observed, and came up with his wave equation. Wolfgang Pauli, another one of the founders, collaborated with Carl Jung, the psychologist, on something called universal archetypes, where we have things like the hero archetype, the trickster archetype, things like that that seem to be common across all our various civilizations, and that those must be embedded somehow in a superconscious layer. And also collaborated with him on the idea of synchronicity, that events can be connected by meaning, not just by cause and effect. Then there was John Wheeler, who championed something called the participatory universe, where our consciousness actually helps create the universe. He called it information creating the universe. He called it from bit. So these are some of the original founders who are looking for what is the meaning of quantum mechanics and what is the meaning of this observer effect and the like. So what happened to their viewpoints? We don't seem to have them now. We seem to think of everything as material, cause and effect, and science will tell us what's going on. This is something called the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which essentially says, if you can make predictions with it, it must be right. It comes out of a famous debate, a running debate between Niels Bohr and Albert Einstein. And Albert Einstein famously told Niels Bohr, you can't tell me that the moon isn't there when I'm not looking at it, which was an implication of quantum mechanics. If an observer isn't there, that physical thing isn't there. You need it to collapse the wave function. And Niels Bohr didn't push back saying, well, no, it's not there. He said, that's not the point. Physics is not about finding out what nature is. It is only about what we can say about nature. If the math predicts the results, stop asking what it means. Einstein hated this. He did not like that shift. He felt that the whole point of science was to figure out what reality was. But the physics kept moving on, and quantum mechanics became the most successful theory in scientific history because it worked. The predictions it made all worked. We have a lot of our modern technology because of it, from semiconductors and computers and the like to lasers. There's so many things where we use quantum mechanics in our world today. But we haven't thought about, what do they mean? We kind of make this assumption that if it works, it must be right. That must be reality. But is that true? Donald Hoffman, another famous scientist, look at our perceptions, how we perceive the world, how I perceive this golf ball. Here it is, right? Physical and the like. How we develop the senses that we have. And those senses, per evolution, are meant to provide us with survival advantages. They're not supposed to tell us about reality. They're supposed to tell us how to survive. So when I'm driving down the road, I can look to my left and my right, I can see cars. I wander the world knowing how to navigate this world, how to find food in this world, how to find mates. But that doesn't mean those things are the nature of reality. And Donald Hoffman came up with the idea that, what if these things that we call physical objects are more like icons on our desktop? And if you think about it, if I take my phone here and see all the icons on it, if I tried to interact with what's really in that phone, the circuit boards, the ones and zeros in those chips, that sort of thing, I would get lost really quickly. I couldn't navigate it. What do? I interface with it using the icons on the screen. Well, what if the physical objects, like this golf ball, are like icons? They don't represent reality. They represent an interface that allows me to interact with reality. What had happened with the shut up and calculate crowd is they can perfectly predict what those icons on the desktop are going to do without ever digging into where do they come from, what's underneath them. We've decided that those icons are the reality. So what happens when you start taking this farther and farther? Well, physicists have gone so far as to say, because if it works, it must be real, we don't need philosophy anymore. All we need is science. But when confronted with the observer problem in consciousness, they've come up with some odd ways to get around it. One of those is what's now used a lot in mainstream science. It's called the many worlds hypothesis, where instead of when you make an observation, the wave function collapses and takes many possibilities and it produces one reality, every time you make an observation in many worlds theory, another universe splits off where the opposite decision was made. And so as you go through your day, every time you make a decision, you turn left on the street instead of right down the street, there's another universe where you turned right instead of left. This creates myriad, infinite numbers of universes. And the math works. Of course, there's no way to ever prove this or ever even falsify it, which is a key grounding in science. But it's a convenient way to get out of the consciousness problem. What they really did is ignore the underlying reality of the circuit boards, the electricity, or in our case, the consciousness, and tried to bridge that gap with these wild ways of doing things. This bothered probably the preeminent mind in physics of our generation, Stephen Hawking. Toward the end of his life, and I will remind you, Stephen Hawking was one of those that said philosophy is dead. He's the one that came up with the theory of black holes. He's the one that came up with what happens to information that goes into black holes. He's one of the smartest minds the 20th century and this civilization has ever had. But toward the end of his life, he was bothered by this many worlds theory. And he kept trying to think, what's really going on here? So he and a close collaborator named Thomas Hertog came up with what is his final cosmology book called On the Origin of Time. It was really a direct attack on the bottom-up many worlds universe, because he realized that was just a mathematical nightmare and just couldn't be describing reality itself. And as he dug into it, he started shifting from a bottom-up reductionist approach to what if we go top-down? What if we see the past as a sum of all histories, as he called it, all the potential histories? And when we make an observation in the present moment, it collapses those potential histories into one history, once again giving the observer a primary role. The quote from the book that I like the most is, "We create the universe as much as the universe creates us." This is from Stephen Hawking, another one who started as a materialist and said philosophy is dead. At the end of his life, embraced philosophy quite directly. So when I started reading about the OGs of physics and Hawking, a bunch of stuff happened for me. I have been meditating for decades at this point. I had enrolled in graduate work in consciousness studies. I had worked at Body, Mind, Spirit magazine at this point. I've dedicated my life essentially outside of my business career to understanding consciousness. And all of this, the physics, the neuroscience, the meditation, the Eastern philosophy, it all suddenly converged in one aha moment that kind of rewired my brain. All those puzzle pieces fit together. And I realized there's only one answer. There can only be one universal consciousness. Our individual minds are not separate entities. They're just different windows open on this same reality. Erwin Schrödinger put it as, there is only one mind. I look at it as, when you look out into the world, you are actually universal consciousness looking back at itself. When you look at someone else, you are universal consciousness looking at yourself as universal consciousness looking back at you. My favorite quote is from Ramana Maharshi, the Indian guru in the 20th century, when he was asked, well, given this, how should we treat others? And he looked and he replied, there are no others.